On the issue of critical race theory, et cetera, I'll obviously have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is. But I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university. And it is important that we train and we understand. And I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. So what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I've read Mao Zedong. I've read Karl Marx. I've read Lenin. That doesn't make me a communist. So what is wrong with understanding, having some situational understanding about the country for which we are here to defend? And I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military, our general officers, our commissioned, non-commissioned officers, of being, quote, woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there.
Whew, that was hot. The nation's top military official fired back today at congressional critics during a House Armed Services Committee hearing that was supposed to be about the 2022 defense budget, but instead veered off into the topic of, you guessed it, critical race theory. Joint Chief of Staff Mark Milley surprisingly, forcefully commented following a tense exchange between Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Congressman Matt Gaetz, who criticized teaching future military officers about critical race theory and Marxism. Gaetz also claimed that a senior advisor to Defense Secretary Austin is a critical race theorist. That was followed by another congressman who criticized the West Point Military Academy for teaching cadets about CRT, as well as teaching a voluntary seminar called Understanding Whiteness and White Rage. Joining me now to discuss is the co-founder and executive director of the Black Veterans Project, Richard Brookshire. Mr. Brookshire, thank you for being here, sir.
Thanks for having me.
So how important was it to have the top brass of the military to push back against this line of questioning in Congress today?
It was incredibly important. I think it was a show of solidarity. Dr. Christina Greer, a mentor of mine, talks about the difference between an ally and an accomplice. And what we saw today was someone in a position of power who happened to be white, being an accomplice and actually standing up and saying something. And I spoke with a West Point graduate by the name of Timothy Berry, who works with our project quite closely. And he mentioned and pointed out, actually, in something I hadn't noticed, that the Secretary of Defense had to essentially not say anything about critical race theory. And then you go on to have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually go on and define it and say it, espouse it unapologetically. And I think that says something about the country and the dynamics at play.
Meaning what? What are you saying about that?
Well, that a white man essentially has to say what the black Secretary of Defense can't.
Wow. So the military is has long been a more integrated community than I think the society at large. A little bit more of a meritocracy, though not complete and not perfect, but a little bit more of a meritocracy than the society at large. Do you believe that they have more of inclination to defend on this issue and other racial issues than other parts of society and government would have?
I mean, the whole basis for our project is that the military has failed at that, right? And so though it's integrated, it's been integrated for quite some time, there are still rampant disparities. And so even when the Secretary of Defense was talking about extremism and how he qualified it was kind of a misnomer, because in many respects, what you really need to get at the root at is how white supremacy is baked into the body of the military and how many people from the bottom up and to the top brass hold these racist sentiments and these racist proclivities. One of the things that we did in the last year was really push for the release of a racial bias survey data that demonstrated, and we were only able to get 1 year of that data, but it demonstrated that 1 in 4, that means 350,000 out of 1.4 million service members had witnessed white nationalism in their ranks just in 2017. This is 3 years before the insurrection, right? 1 year into the Trump presidency. And we also saw that 1/3 from that data set, 1/3 of Black service members felt uncomfortable reporting instances of racism for fear of retribution, right? And so these stats that Congressman Gates was, pointing to, which were relatively just collected at his own discretion and didn't speak to something that a whole institution was at least attempting to aggregate, which was that racial bias survey data. It's misleading on many, many, many levels.
So how important is it then that the military continue their work of kind of racial training, full of racial history, for at least for these officers, including critical race theory, if they choose to teach that? Because we've seen so many former military people who were part of the insurrection. There have been warnings from officials about whether or not former military were able to be recruited or radicalized into kind of white supremacist violence. There is a real thing there. How important is it to continue this work of trying to ferret that out, but also to train people to be better soldiers and better human beings?
I mean, it's incredibly important, and I think the military hasn't been as deeply committed to this effort as it should have been historically. I think the appointment of General Lloyd Austin is symbolic in many respects, and I know he's just trying. But even the example that Matt Gaetz gave about Bishop Garrison, I think it conflated critical race theory. Right? What we're talking about when we talk about critical race theory was what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, which was how American law was kind of deeply entrenched by anti-Black racism and built on, the idea that Black human beings were 3/5 of a person, and everything kind of built from that principle, and it manifests today. And he takes a series of tweets and then misrepresents them when what he was talking about specifically was the law and order that the disrespect of law and order that the former president had essentially incited with the insurrection. So again, I think just misleading on its face there, but it's really, really, really important that the military gets this right. But the I think barrier for a lot of this is that it has wide-reaching implications, because this idea that extremism is somehow new in the military, or the fact that white nationalism isn't somehow a new phenomenon in the military, is incredibly inaccurate. They've always been there, right? And we're just starting to see, because of the rise of someone like President Trump, them wanting to rear their heads and kind of show their force a bit more. But you have to also understand that as it stands now, and this will be my last point, as it stands now, you can actually belong to a hate group and still not get punished for that, right? You actually have to actively commit a hate crime. And so that's what they're talking about when they talk about extremism. And it's not a starting point. Right. I don't believe it's enough of a starting point.
Richard Brookshire, thank you so much for joining me tonight, sir. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.